There are more Pokemon games than just the main series lineup, and one of the most popular side series is the Mystery Dungeon games. Instead of being a trainer on a quest to complete a collection of gym badges, you are put in the body of a Pokemon and get to see how the world works from their perspective. Do the Mystery Dungeon games live up to the quality of the originals, or are they just a waste of time? It all started with Pokemon Red and Blue Rescue Team, which released on September 18th, 2006 in North America, November 17th, 2005 in Japan, November 10th, 2006 in Europe, and September 28th, 2006 in Australia. These games are practically the same. While Red released on the Game Boy Advance, Blue released on the Nintendo DS. They brought the roguelike dungeon crawling genre to the world of Pokemon, creating a unique experience that was different from the traditional RPGs that everyone was used to. But the gameplay is still fun. The big twist of these games is that you wake up as a Pokemon.
Oh my god! Oh wait, I'm a Mudkip? It's fine.
The game has you start by taking a personality quiz that determines what Pokemon you'll become. It's a simple test that asks you personality questions, but if you're anything like me, you retook this quiz at least 7 times to get the Pokemon you wanted to be. You meet a partner Pokemon who will be your best friend throughout the journey, and together you form a rescue team to help Pokemon in need. As you take on rescue missions, you start to uncover the mystery behind the natural disasters that are affecting the world. While you go on your missions to help Pokemon, you also get more insight as to how you became a Pokemon in the first place. The gameplay is where Mystery Dungeon really stands out from the mainline series. It's all about exploring randomly generated dungeons. Every time you enter a dungeon, the layout changes, and you have to fight enemies, find items, and rescue Pokemon along the way. This is a roguelike, so for some people it's not their cup of tea, but for me this is a near perfect execution of a great idea. Randomly generated dungeons are great to explore because every time you play through this game, you're going to have a slightly different experience. It's not going to be a wild change that affects the story at all, but it's still enough to not become monotonous on each playthrough. You control both your character and your partner using turn-based combat and strategic item management to get through the floors and get to the end of the dungeon. The combat system is turn-based, but it works on a grid similar to what you would see in Fire Emblem, and every single time you move, so do your enemies, which adds a decent level of strategy for positioning your Pokemon. You can recruit wild Pokemon to join your rescue team by defeating them in battle and having them join your squad for future missions. This was the first entry in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, and it laid a solid foundation for the future games. The story was surprisingly deep, and getting to experience the life of a Pokemon at first hand was really interesting. They found a great way to make a game where you are a Pokemon and have it still be fun and story driven. You don't have to sit around in a Pokeball waiting for a battle. You get to explore the world of Pokemon as it really is. And while the mainline Pokemon games were more about adventure and becoming the champion, Red and Blue Rescue Team had a strong focus on friendship, community, and self-discovery. Now, the only real difference between these two versions was the hardware they were available on. There were some Pokemon who were technically version exclusives, but you could still obtain them via the mail. But overall, as the first games in the series, they did a great job introducing the idea and were really fun. That being said, it did have some rough edges. The dungeons do get repetitive even with the randomly generated aspects because they're kind of bare bones. And having the same mechanics repeat themselves over and over got a little boring, especially towards the end. But by far, the most annoying thing was the AI for your partner Pokemon was an absolute liability. They would just wander off on their own sometimes and use up all your items even when you didn't want them to. The difficulty scaling was rough too. Some dungeons were extremely easy while others were incredibly difficult. And if you faint in a dungeon, you lose all your items and money, making it even harder the next time. But it was the first game in the series, so it gets a pass for some game design issues. This surprisingly got ported to Switch Online recently, so if you have an online membership and you're interested in checking out the original, you finally can pretty easily. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Darkness released on April 20th, 2008 in North America, September 13th, 2007 in Japan, July 4th, 2008 in Europe, and June 19th, 2008 in Australia. These took everything that was great about Red and Blue Rescue Team and improved upon it in almost every single way. It expanded on the story, the gameplay, and the overall world building. Once again, the story begins with you waking up as a Pokemon with zero memory of how you got there in the first place.
I see a trend starting.
After taking another personality quiz, you're turned into a Pokemon and meet your partner who convinces you to join an exploration team at Wigglytuff's guild. This time, the plot revolves around the concept of time itself, with mysterious events causing time to stop in certain areas. You set off on a journey to investigate the Time Gears, which are mystical artifacts that control the flow of time. You find out the real threat is Darkrai, who's trying to plunge the entire world into darkness by controlling time. Without spoiling anything, the plot gets surprisingly deep, with twists and emotional moments that tug on your heartstrings just like in the first games. The combat is really similar to Red and Blue Rescue Team, with turn-based combat on grids using randomly generated dungeons. However, this time, it introduced a ton of new features, including a roster of over 490 recruitable Pokemon.
Oh my god! Oh, it's fine.
One of the biggest changes, though, from the previous games was the introduction of more complex dungeon layouts and new dungeon mechanics like weather effects. It made exploring dungeons far more interesting. But the story was hands down the biggest draw. It was really deep, and it touched on themes of sacrifice, betrayal, and destiny. Oh my god, are you crying right now?
No. I'm just sweating out of my eye holes.
The bond between the player and their partner is central to the game, and by the end, it's one of the greatest stories in all of Pokemon. Couple that with the expanded roster of Pokemon, the additional legendary boss battles, and a deeper strategy involved in the dungeon mechanics, and there was so much to do to make this game a massive improvement, it feels like it was a night and day difference. Even though this game still could feel repetitive, especially in longer sessions towards the end, and the fact that they didn't quite fix the difficulty spikes, which could be very intense, it still is a great game overall and a massive improvement on the originals. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky released on October 12th, 2009 in North America, April 18th, 2009 in Japan, November 20th, 2009 in Europe, and November 12th, 2009 in Australia. This wasn't a direct sequel, but more of an enhanced version of Explorers of Time and Darkness, similar to how Pokemon Emerald was to Ruby and Sapphire. The story of Explorers of Sky is essentially the same as it was in Time and Darkness, but this time it included new side stories called Special Episodes, which offered additional content. The new episodes gave players more backstory on key characters like Wigglytuff and the rest of the guild members, and expanded on the lore of the world in ways that, after playing this version, feel like they should have been in the original. The expanded content, along with the incredible story, made Explorers of Sky the definitive version of the Explorers games, but for double the price, I would rather pick up the originals.
I just sold my house to buy this game.
It's an enhanced version for sure, but with a small amount of changes, I wouldn't say it's worth a huge jump in price. If you already played the previous games, there wasn't a ton of new content to justify the purchase. But if you had to pick one of them not based on the price, this was a no-brainer. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates of Infinity released on March 24th, 2013 in North America, November 23rd, 2012 in Japan, May 17th, 2013 in Europe, and May 18th, 2013 in Australia. This game brought the series into the 3D era and introduced a lot of changes, some which were good and some which weren't so much. The story, once again, has a player who is transformed into a Pokemon, teaming up with a partner Pokemon to form a rescue team. This time, though, the focus is on building a paradise for Pokemon, a home where Pokemon can live in peace. But an entity known as the Bitter Cold, which is a mysterious force, threatens to freeze the entire world and wants to crush your dreams. One of the biggest improvements was the switch to fully 3D environments and models. The game looks incredible on the 3DS, with colorful visuals and smooth animations. With how controversial the move to the 3DS was for the main series games, I was expecting a lot more backlash about these. But I think everyone can say that this looks great. Another great change was the ability to customize aspects of your home base, which added new layers of depth to the gameplay and, for people like me, aesthetic charm. But Gates of Infinity had a lot of problems. The biggest issue was the lack of Pokemon. The roster was severely cut down compared to the last games, which was a huge letdown for fans who were used to recruiting hundreds of different Pokemon.
I'm gonna write whoever cut Bellsprout out of this game a strongly worded letter.
A lot of fan favorite Pokemon were missing from the game, and it was a huge letdown. It also felt like a more streamlined and simplified version, losing some of the complexity that made the earlier entries so beloved. The changes were made to simplify the game, but it made it lose a lot of the depth that made the games fun in the first place. But even with these changes, it is still fun, and the story is still great. It had a great focus on a group of characters as opposed to just having the focus be on you and your partner Pokemon. The Bitter Cold wasn't a bad idea, but it wasn't my favorite either. It was a culmination of all of the negative emotions that Pokemon have. And considering you're trying to build a paradise for Pokemon to forget their problems, it was interesting to have to face the exact opposite of that. But the story wasn't bad at all, it just wasn't as good as the Explorers games. But overall, I think this game gets too much hate. They finally listened to the difficulty spike issue, but now it's a little too easy.
How do we keep messing this up?
It's because all of the game developers turned into Pokemon.
Wait, does someone get turned into a Lopunny?
You can't say what? Pokémon Super Mystery Dungeon released on November 20th, 2015 in North America, September 17th, 2015 in Japan, February 19th, 2016 in Europe, and February 20th, 2016 in Australia. Super Mystery Dungeon was a return to form for the series, bringing back many of the fan-favorite features that fans loved. all while still introducing new mechanics and improvements. Of course, the story revolved around a human being transformed into a Pokemon, but this time the plot focuses on a mysterious event that's causing Pokemon to be turned into stone. Am I gonna be okay?
I think you're good.
You and your partner Pokemon must travel across the world, meeting legendary Pokemon and trying to figure out what is happening to make these Pokemon turn into stone. This is my second favorite story in the series, with a big focus on meeting legendary Pokemon throughout the game. You have to save the Tree of Life from being corrupted by dark matter, and it leads you on a journey with the Expedition Society to save the day. Now, dark matter and the Tree of Life were weird things to introduce into a Pokemon game, but overall the story does a great job of telling a tale, even if it doesn't take itself seriously at the end. But one of the biggest draws about Super Mystery Dungeon was the return of the massive roster of over 700 recruitable Pokemon. Not only that, it also introduced new mechanics like the Connection Orb, which allowed players to form bonds with other Pokemon and unlock new missions and dungeons, which make the game feel so much more in line with a typical Mystery Dungeon game from the DS. It brought back the more complex and strategic gameplay and a story that was filled with emotional moments and high stakes. But with all the good things it brought back, it also brought back difficulty spikes. And the game felt different too. The focus was more shifted towards items in the previous games, which was good and bad. It made it so whatever Pokemon you wanted to play as was equally viable, and you weren't punished for playing who you want to play. But the over-reliance on items made it so if you're not lucky, you can kinda get stuck due to RNG. And the recruiting mechanics don't work the same way they used to. It requires you to do missions in order to recruit certain Pokemon, which makes it harder to get the Pokemon you want. But at the end of the day, the game is still great. It doesn't exactly play like the other games in the series, which is fine. The story and the focus on items make it stand out in a good way, even if it's not the peak of the series. I think it's fun and approachable for anyone who likes any of the previous titles. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX released on March 6th, 2020 worldwide. This is a full remake of Red and Blue Rescue Team with updated visuals, new mechanics, and quality of life improvements that came in the later games in the series. The story remains largely the same. You wake up as a Pokemon, form a rescue team, and embark on missions to help other Pokemon and uncover the mystery of your transformation. The emotional moments are still there, and the updated visuals make the story even more impactful. The game looks stunning and is a huge upgrade to the originals. Red and Blue have their own appealing art style, but this just looks way better. It looks like a hand-drawn storybook, and it gives the world a vibrant and fresh feel.
Look, I made a mystery dungeon!
The gameplay also saw improvements, with streamlined mechanics like auto movement options and faster paced battles, which improved the originals in almost every way. If you loved the original Rescue Team games, this was a perfect nostalgia trip for you in my opinion, and this is now the best way to get into the series. The new mechanics made everything smoother, and the core gameplay loop really hasn't changed that much. The only thing I can say that would have made this better is that they added a bonus mode or something that wasn't in the originals to make it really stand out. But even without it, it's still a solid game overall, and is still the best way to get into the series. So if you haven't played these games and want to, I recommend checking this out. Now technically there were other Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, but they don't really count because they were WiiWare exclusives and they didn't really have the same appeal as the others. But after looking back at every main entry in the series, the games were great and are absolutely worth checking out even to this day. They delivered some of the most emotional and heartfelt stories in the Pokemon franchise. The bond between the player and their partner Pokemon, the themes of friendship, sacrifice, and destiny, and the sheer joy of exploring randomized dungeons as a Pokemon made this game series really stand out. Not only for fans of Mystery Dungeon games, but for any Pokemon fan who wants to try something different from the mainline games. Mystery Dungeon was a dream come true, and if you haven't checked it out yet, I really do recommend it. And as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you like anything you saw here, please consider subscribing.